hope you're doing well this morning, given the fact that we had an announcement from the U.S. administration. But in any event, Ian and I are still on task with trying to work through all of this and certainly clear the clouds out of the way so that there's hope for the Canadian economy, especially in the Waterloo region. But this morning we're joined by our friend and former colleague. He was the president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, of course. I always introduce him as the best prime minister we never had. That's just because he is the best prime minister we never had, and that's the Honorable Perrin Beatty, formerly minister of just about everything. But also what's really important about having Perrin on this morning is that he was around in the very beginning of NAFTA agreements coming. Our relationship with the United States goes back a long time, and he has a stellar history with respects to that. So, Perrin, welcome this morning. Thanks very much for taking time out of your day to come and join us.
Thanks, Greg. Glad to be with you.
And I always introduce you, Perrin, as my dear friend because my old friend is Greg, and Greg is my old friend. You're my dear friend, Perrin. Listen, thank you for spending some time with us today. I mean, yesterday, let's start with the immediate news of what you know of the news yesterday, because everyone's still trying to digest it. When does it come into force? There is some questions around as it relates to autos. What portion of a manufactured vehicle is the parts component that qualify as U.S. made? So there's a lot of questions even within the executive order. But less about that, what does this say about where we're going? Because I think there's always been this expectation that sanity might prevail, that this is going to harm American companies on their side of the border and workers as well as ours. What do you think it says about the announcement that was made yesterday?
Ian, I think what it says is, well, you can still afford one, buy a seatbelt and fasten your seatbelt. This is going to be the story for the next while. And what we're dealing with an administration which is belligerent and which is extremely unpredictable, and where it's inflicting serious damage on the United States, certainly on Canada, but on all of the world at this point. There's no sign of him turning back at this point, and what we've got to expect next Wednesday is that he will be extending these tariffs across the board to a whole range of other areas as well. We simply don't know at this point how Canada is going to be affected. He has constantly changed what he's been talking about. We don't know, for example, what's going to happen with the threat of 25% across the board tariffs as a result of fentanyl and illegal migration. Entirely artificial, entirely invented excuse to give him legal authority to be able to invoke emergency powers. And there's absolutely no way that Canada can satisfy criteria which haven't been set and which deal with less than 1% of the illegal immigration into the U.S. and less than 1% of the fentanyl. We don't know whether that will go away and be subsumed into other tariffs, or whether he'll be stacking tariffs on tariffs, which is what he may very well will do. The nature of his tariffs on all of the world has changed a great deal. He talked about entire reciprocity, but that would be moving thousands of lines of tariff items to millions of lines of tariff items if you were to do that. It's just not feasible to do that. So the Americans have moved away from, you tax our pens coming in at 10%, we'll tax you on your pens at 10%. They then talked about fitting countries into categories: worst offender, less offensive, least offensive, with different rates. This could be it. We don't know, with the lowest rate possibly being 15%. We don't know at this point. There's some discussion that after he imposes the tariffs, it may be possible to negotiate your way down. But I think what we anticipate is that to do that, he'll be issuing a list of demands to Canada that are simply not acceptable for Canada to meet. For example, he considers our GST or VATs in other countries to be a trade barrier or an unacceptable subsidy, are we going to abolish our tax system to satisfy Donald Trump? Obviously, things like dairy come back onto the table as well. So at this point, we simply don't know, and we can expect to see a good deal of chaos for the foreseeable future.
You know, one of the concerns, I think, I just heard it this morning, actually, was the fact that, you know, he's going to impose even higher tariffs if Canada and the European Union connect together to try and do trade to usurp the dependency on the American business. You know, this sounds like, you know, trying to actually capture all of the world's economy into their borders only, and that they're going to keep penalizing people until we succumb to what Donald Trump wants. It just seems to be him holding the world hostage, at least those of us that care. The ones that don't care, China, Russia, Iran, those places, they're just going to continue to do what they do, and he's going to continue to prop them up on a pedestal in his mind. But the fact of the matter is, I don't know, and I understand he can do, I guess, what he wants to do, but when is the rest of the world going to stand up and just say, well, that's fine, you go ahead and do that. You're going to be isolated anyway, because you can put any tariff you want on us. If we're doing business with Europe, you're not going to be able to do anything about that. You can't impose tariffs on things we're trading with other countries.
This is going to have negative effects on the United States. We'll see it on the stock market to begin with. We've seen some of that already, and we'll see more of that. I'm in the United States right now. What there is among ordinary Americans, many of whom voted for him, is an awareness for the first time that this is a tax on them. And indeed, the Canadian government is putting up billboards in selected areas in the United States saying tariffs are a tax, to make it clear that Americans are having to pay the price on this. They will see the impact on employment in the U.S. We could very well find that if tariffs come in on Wednesday on automobiles and automobile parts, that the automotive sector on both sides of the border start to shut down about a week later, as parts are missing and as assembly lines go down. This will be noticed in the United States as well. So it's very damaging in the United States. That'll become much more apparent. But also in the rest of the world, people have generally, other countries have kept their heads low while he's been focused on Canada and on Mexico. Increasingly, they're seeing themselves come into the gun sights. So the Europeans are starting to become much more aware. I was listening to an item today saying the Japanese are very concerned, as are the Koreans and others. You'll get this pushback. The difficulty is that he is trying to do exactly what you're talking about. He's trying to reconfigure the whole of the global trading system and all of our value chains around the world, and to drive them into the United States. Even if that were desirable, that's not something you can do overnight. You can't, with a car plant, put it on wheels and simply drag it across the 49th parallel. It literally takes years to be able to reconfigure this. And as a consequence, both for the United States, there's going to be continuing chaos there, and they're not going to be able to achieve the repatriation of manufacturing and of investment as rapidly as Donald Trump needs to do. But it also means that for our part, we do 3/4 of our trade with the United States. We can't change that overnight and move it to Europe or to Thailand or to Korea. Throughout our lifetimes, most of our trade will probably continue to be done with the United States. And that means then that there's going to be a transitional period here that's extremely difficult for us and for everybody else. If we're to move to Europe, for example, and to say we're going to drop the business we're doing in the United States, we're going to take it up with Europe. Europe's regulatory structure is so entirely different from ours that it means retooling how we produce things to go into that market. That is very difficult. Worst of all possible worlds is if we're trying to maintain parallel systems, one for Europe, one for the United States, maybe a different one for Asia. So what we have to anticipate for the foreseeable future is an enormous amount of pain and an enormous amount of chaos before things sort themselves out.
So, Perrin, let's talk about the pain part, because I don't think we can talk about the detail. I think it's important how the Canadian government responds, both during this election and the words that get said, but post-election. Certainly my hope that it's a majority government, and I don't really care which flavor it is, but we need a strong, majority government in Ottawa, because they're going to have to make some really tough decisions. Now, one would hope they do it collaboratively, but we need to be able to make some decisions. What, how are we, how is the election in Canada playing out to us not reacting, or is it playing a role in us not reacting and doing the things we should be doing right now? Or is this, to some extent, our election cycle is irrelevant. Trump is going to do what he was going to do. How do you kind of put those two pieces together?
Ian, I agree with you that what we need, whatever the political party Canadians choose to lead, it needs a solid majority. The new prime minister needs to be able to go down, sit across from Donald Trump and say, Canadians have spoken, and they've given me a solid mandate to be able to stand up for Canada's interests. So the worst possible outcome would be a minority government with great uncertainty and instability in Canada. Now, you ask about what is the impact of the election itself? Does it prevent us from doing things we might otherwise do? My suspicion is that it has the opposite effect, that it drives the politicians trying to compete with each other on the grounds of who's going to be Captain Canada and stand up for the country. And it possibly is going to cause our political leaders to be more bellicose than they would otherwise be. What we need at this point is to have the adults in the room to be reasoned and rational about what we're doing, to be very firm and determined, and to make it clear to Donald Trump that the country will not be broken by him. But if it's simply chest beating, that's not helpful. All it does is it inflames the MAGA base in the United States, and it sustains the support that Trump needs domestically. The important thing for Canadians to understand is that this fight ultimately will be won not in Ottawa, but in the United States, and not in Washington, but outside of Washington and the rest of the country. American politicians will stop when American voters say to them, it's time for this to end now, because this is costing us too much. And so we need to differentiate between the American people and the American government, first of all. The American people, every poll shows, remain our friends, even if the American government has turned hostile. And we need to make sure that we focus on how do we take that message out. In the meantime, as we tailor our response, first, we have no choice but to retaliate. When you're dealing with a bully, if you say, go ahead and hit me again, I won't do anything, you invite more of that. So little that I like the retaliation, we have no choice. Secondly, at some point, all wars come to an end. And you sit down at the negotiating table, we have to have something to be able to trade. And we don't want to go into the negotiating table with Trump, with him saying, okay, I will trade down my tariffs, and here's my list of things that you have to give up that we are maintaining today. By having counter tariffs and other measures in place, we have things that we can trade on a quid quo pro basis, and we shouldn't give up anything without getting something in return. That's my sense of where we are. But the risk of taking us away from just a trade discussion, there are much broader implications here that Canadians and Canadian politicians have to look at. Here's the bottom line. I was part of the government that brought in, as you were mentioning, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA. And all of our relationships for the last 3.5 decades have been based on the premise that we're in this together, that we would be more successful being partners than being adversaries. And that whatever the strains that would come up from time to time in the bilateral relationship, both of us knew that we were stronger together, and that neither of us would ever do anything to deliberately harm the other. That's gone out the window. And what Donald Trump has done is to permanently change the relationship between the United States and the rest of the world, but particularly between the United States and Canada. We cannot, what has happened is the United States under Donald Trump in the last 2 months has moved from being the anchor of democracy, of stability, of the rule of law, of prosperity and open trade, to being a risk to be mitigated. Any of your business people in KW and Cambridge, if you're looking at making an investment, you're going to be saying, what are the rules? How are they going to change? Is it safe to make this investment? And on a whim, can Donald Trump change things for me? You have to mitigate that risk. That is so different from the way in which it's been about how do we expand this business? How do we grow our trade? And the same applies on the defense side.
I was just going to come to that, Perrin, because I want to connect it with the immediacy here. What we're hearing, and certainly Greg and I and our colleagues at Best Waterloo are saying, we've got to deal with the immediate crisis and assist businesses now in this uncertainty. But we've also said, like many other business organizations, you led the chamber when we talked about ending interprovincial trade barriers, when we talked about trade enabling infrastructure like pipelines to Tidewater, fundamental tax reform that hasn't happened in decades. We have to modernize our own economy, get more productivity, and we have to do that even while we're going through this pain. Because if we're going to at least have some separation, and Greg and I have talked about this, we'll always have, that will be our major trading partner, but we can't be 75%. We've got to get that down where we're not so beholden to them. And then you're about to talk about military. The connection between NATO, military investment, and the global security, that's changed as well. I guess the question for you, and I think you're coming to it, is we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. Deal with the crisis, but plan for the future, which can't be in the distance. It's got to be in the next 2, 3, 4 years we get some of those things done.
Absolutely. And in the case of interprovincial barriers to trade, which you and I have been pressing for years to have governments do something about, and it just didn't get done. This should be done this afternoon. A starting point for us in any of this, Ian, is that we have to say, okay, let's be honest with ourselves about what's our starting point. The starting point is there is no going back. If Donald Trump this afternoon announced that he was lifting all tariffs and that he was just joking about this 51st state stuff, we still couldn't go back to where we were in December. Because what he's done is to demonstrate that the presumption of goodwill in Washington no longer applies. And we have to be aware of the fact that if not him, J.D. Vance or any of their successors could do something similar. So we can't go back to where we were. That is wrenching in terms of the difficulty to get our heads around that. What does that lead to then? Well, it means that we have to re-examine all aspects of our relationship: security, sovereignty, the economy and trade and so on, management of the border. All of that has to be looked at. We should ask ourselves, what are the principles that have to underlie whatever we're doing? First is we have to look at ways to ensure that we are never so reliant on the United States again, that if they're either Donald Trump or any of his successors can't inflict the sort of damage to Canada that he's determined to do today. So what do we do to mitigate the risk? And that includes such things as broadening our trade to other countries, taking down internal barriers and so on. Secondly, we need to look at what can we do to ensure that Canada is prepared for shocks in the future, wherever they come from. Could come from China, could come from Russia, could be another pandemic. What do we do to ensure that we have the resiliency in Canada that we can absorb these shocks? What we've done in the last 10 years is to dither as our productivity relative to our trading partners has fallen, and as we've become more vulnerable. Never, never, never again. We've got to go back to basics and build an economy that works, that's strong and resilient. Then in the area of security and foreign policy, we've got to get our heads around the fact that the United States may very well not be there when we need them. Tomorrow, J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, is flying to Greenland against the wishes of the Danish government and the government of Greenland to try to provoke the situation so that the United States at some point can absorb Greenland. Donald Trump threatened to use military force against Denmark, which is a NATO partner, which sent troops to Afghanistan alongside the Americans to defend the Americans there. The whole world has changed. And we have to, Donald Trump last week, when he was talking about sales of military equipment, said, his candor was striking. He said, when we sell military equipment, including the next generation of fighter jets to our allies, we're going to hold back some of the technology so they're not quite as capable, because we don't know whether they're going to continue to be allies or not. Excuse me. The big issue for us right now is the F-35s. And there's a debate as to whether there's a kill switch that the Americans have to turn it off. I don't believe that's the case, but the F-35 is a flying computer, and it needs constant updates. And if the Americans hold back those updates, the utility declines very rapidly. The more sophisticated the piece of equipment, the faster it declines if you can't continue to update it. And what Donald Trump did with Ukraine, where he pulled back on the sharing of intelligence information with the Ukrainians, was he cost lives in Ukraine, because part of this intelligence information was the Russians are launching missiles. Here's the apparent target, and the Ukrainians could prepare to defend themselves against that, or their fighter jets coming out. This is where they appear to be going. He chose to withhold that information for political reasons, to force the Ukrainians to capitulate. We have to ask ourselves honestly, can we count on the United States to be there when we need them? If either China or Russia were to challenge us in the Canadian Arctic, particularly in the Northwest Passage, which the United States doesn't accept as belonging to Canada, would Donald Trump be there to defend Canada's claim? And if you know the answer to that, you are much wiser than I am. But that's what happens, where the country that has become the anchor, the bulwark, the rock on which everything else is founded, moves to become a potential threat. It changes all of the equation.
Last week, Perrin, we had Sherry Ann Kelly from the Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives in out of Washington. We had her on, and basically she's explaining the situation from the American perspective, and maybe you can because you've been spending some time down there, maybe you have a little feeling from a Canadian perspective, but she was basically saying, yes, of course, every chamber of commerce across the United States thinks that tariffs are wrong, that they support free trade with Canada and Mexico, but that is not their priority. Their priority right now is the preservation of their own democracy. That's the concern that they have in the United States right now. From certainly from the business perspective, they're really worried that the leadership, or that the institution of government in the United States is becoming very authoritarian. What do you hear from people there in Americans on what their feeling is?
The first thing is the experience of all of us who are Canadians who've been in the US over the last while has been that the American people have continued to be warm and welcoming. And it is not at all uncommon for us to be stopped by our American neighbors who know that we're Canadians, who say, look, I just want to apologize. I don't know why this is happening. I'm humiliated by it, and it's wrong, and I want to apologize. You'll get the occasional person you'll get some who feel it's funny to joke about 51st state, and they pull back very quickly when you say that isn't funny at all. Um, and you'll get the occasional sort of MAGA zealot who's very aggressive, who simply drinks the Kool-Aid and will do whatever Donald Trump wants him to do. But the vast majority of Americans, the starting point is that that Americans, including those Americans who voted for Donald Trump, did not expect to be seeing what they're seeing today. It was not his policy to put Canada at the top of his hit list, that he would treat Canada more aggressively than he would treat the rest of the world in terms of the economic relationship. So at a minimum, people are scratching their heads and saying, I don't understand this. Secondly, among most Americans, the ones who weren't deeply committed one way or the other, the deciding issue was the cost of living in the United States. And so many Americans voted for Donald Trump because he had promised to bring down the cost of living. They're absolutely mystified that what he is doing as a first step is to dramatically increase the price in the grocery store, at the pump. Here in Florida, if you're making repairs after hurricanes, the cost of building materials and so on. And this goes directly against what he had promised to his voters. So you're getting a complete reevaluation on the part of Americans at this point. On Inauguration Day, I watched the American media very closely. They weren't focusing on, is there going to be a trade war with Canada? Their focus was, is he going to save TikTok? Suddenly the priorities have changed, and people are.
Oh, I think he's
Development to be great has been the failure of the U.S. business community to respond as it should. For the most part, they're keeping their heads down, and they're afraid. You saw what he did to a law firm last week, where he extorted millions of dollars of legal services from them, so they could continue to function, and they caved. Most of the business leadership in the United States is very muted in what they're saying.
Well, that's the last question I wanted to kind of come to, and then maybe we should open it up. Greg, is like between now, so we've got the immediacy of the tariffs have been some was announced yesterday for auto, the rest on Tuesday, and so between that and whatever else is next, and the midterm elections, because I think there's some hope that the spell will be broken, as you rightfully point out, by politicians who actually have to put their name on a ballot in just short of 2 years. When the voters start saying in every congressional district, what are you doing? But between now and then, what do we do? Like they're not listening to Canadian stories of, if you do this to us, here's how it impacts your American, businesses and employers or workers. What are the things that we can be doing? And certainly we're trying to do that advocacy piece, but you got businesses here and those that will listen after to this podcast. What are the types of things you would recommend that we focus on? Because it's a long time away. It's what, 25 months? No, 23 months from the midterms. It's a long time to wait to hope that somebody puts reins on President Trump.
Yeah, it is indeed. However, you're quite right. It's less than 23 months because it'll be November. But essentially 2 years from the last election, all of Congress and a third of the Senate is up for re-election. Now, when you're into that election cycle, a year before that, you start to say, where am I in the polls? What am I hearing from my constituents? Are we on the right track, or do we have to change course? So it's really the next year, the rest of this year, that is, I think, the greatest risk, where he controls the House, he controls the Senate, he controls the administration, he controls the judiciary, and he's determined to push on. What there isn't today is organized opposition within the United States, within the business community or elsewhere. I think that will start to form. And I think it'll start to form over the course of this year. Now, what do we need to do as Canadians? We will have to retaliate. We'll have to tighten our belts at home because there's a cost to us in this retaliation, and it's significant. Um, Canadians are already voting with their feet and with their dollars. And it's wonderful to see that, because it means that we've rediscovered the importance of our country to us, and we're doing what we can to make a difference. And it is striking here at a place like Florida to see there definitely is an impact on the economy here, and people are noticing it, and they're saying this isn't good. This was not what we bargained for when we voted for this guy. Businesses have to look at, what is my business plan? How do I survive this next while? How do I plan to develop new markets? How do I ensure that with my suppliers, that if American products, if American inputs are going to be tariffed, how do I diversify my suppliers? Do I have other sources of supply either in Canada or elsewhere that are acceptable? And so there are all sorts of business and other decisions that we need to make, but we most of all need to be absolutely resolute. We need to talk with one voice. We need to ensure that whoever speaks for us has a solid mandate. And we need to make it very clear to Donald Trump that we will not be broken.
Yeah.
Totally
Perrin,
agree.
just before we open it up, a number of years ago, I was a part of an initiative from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce called the Resource Champions, and we went to Fort McMurray, had incredible tour of both the excavation of bitumen from the ground, but also the in situ type of mining for oil. We also went to Kitimat, BC, and Prince Rupert, and the Port of Vancouver. Had some great tours there to really understand our resource economy and how important our resources to us are. We know, and every single leader in this election is talking about building pipelines and getting our resources to Tidewater so that we can sell them to the global market that's actually out there demanding it or asking for it and wanting to buy it from us. The problem that I see is Bill C-69 is still going to be in the way of that, regardless of whether a government wants it. Do you think if Mark Carney were to have a majority government, do you think that he's going to be prepared to get rid of Bill C-69 in order to get pipelines across the country?
I personally believe so, that if not the bill itself, much of the substance. Now, that's not clear at this point, but he's made it clear that he has stated that he's in favor of getting our resources to the position where they can be properly exported. But this is an example, Craig, of what was wrong in the last 10 years, where we were actively working against the ability of Canadians to get their resources to global markets. And this is insane. What we've seen taking place since then is, even in Quebec on the issue of pipelines, public opinion has swung dramatically, with people saying, we need to build these. We need to be able to get first of all, we need to be able to serve our own market. But secondly, we need to be able to get our resources to global markets as well. And instead of debating plastic straws, we should be talking about, how do we improve our productivity in Canada? How do we get our products to market? How do we become a nation of builders again? How do we strengthen our economy and start returning to first principles? I think the message that Canadians are giving at this point, whoever they vote for, is that we can't continue on the course that we've been on for the last several years. We have to change. We have to take responsibility for our own fate.
Yeah.
One of the just to end on that, Perrin, it was interesting when this all started. I think it was March the 2nd, I guess, and that first Friday when he kind of started to announce this. That whole weekend, everyone was saying, geez, we can't rely on them. We should do interprovincial trade barriers and pipelines. The message started coming out. We have to do more of this. And then all of a sudden, the stories changed on Tuesday when we got the first 30-day reprieve was, geez, that's hard stuff to do. Like pipelines, we have to get approvals. Wow, tax reform's really hard. I mean, if this is going to be up to the Canadian people, to their government saying, you have to do the heavy lifting. And certainly business is going to be there saying, we have to do those tough things. And there will be some difficulty with it, interprovincial trade barriers, tax reform, but we have no choice. Like this is so existential. We have to demand that governments do unpopular things, even when we're saying you should do it. And then maybe the public opinion polls say, well, I don't really like what you're doing. They have to do those hard things. And that's just not been the experience in the last 10 years. Frankly, even in the Harper years, like they didn't do some of what could have been done. Is this a different moment where Canadians are going to have to demand of themselves and their government that we get those things done?
Yes, but bottom line, it's essential that we do that. Now, will it be easy? No, it won't. The Canadian political tradition has been that a crisis comes along, we go into a frenzy about the crisis becomes averted, and then we roll over and go back to sleep. The government created a cabinet committee on Canada-U.S. relations as we were negotiating CUSMA. This was a crisis. NAFTA was in jeopardy. They abolished the cabinet committee after this was done. Why would we not have been, knowing that this was going to come up for renewal? Why would we not have been very focused on this relationship with our customer, to whom we sell 75% of what we export? This is crazy. COVID, we went through this wrenching experience with COVID. It's gone. Are we prepared for the next pandemic? Have we had an independent review of the lessons learned from COVID? What did we do right? What did we do wrong? How could we prepare for the next one? No, that we've moved on. Well, that was so last year. We've moved on to something else. The challenge here is going to be that we're talking about a fundamental re-examination of all aspects of Canadian public policy as it relates to security, sovereignty, the economy, culture, a whole range of other areas. And it is very hard to have any initiative survive a change in government. The guys who come in and say, oh, that was the old regime, scrapping that, I've got my own plan here. To do the sort of transformation that's required in Canada, we are talking at a minimum of a decade and probably decades. And the strategy has to be solid, it has to be supported by the public, and it has to be able to withstand changes of government over the years, so we stay on track. Countries like Singapore are able to come up with a strategy, stick to it, make it happen, and the results are extremely impressive. That's not something in the past that we've been very successful with in Canada. That has to change.
Yeah, I think Singapore was a great example through the pandemic. They were, really a very highly dense country of people living on top of people, and their relative infections and deaths were moderate compared to the people that they serve, because they had lessons learned from the past, and they developed a plan and stuck to it. But anyway, if there's any questions out there, would love to, I'm sure Perrin would love to answer them or attempt to answer them. Please
or
just
defer to you too.
Yeah. Please just hop on if you want to unmute and go ahead and ask away. Come on, don't be shy, for crying out loud.
Perrin, I was just about to say, while they're formulating their questions, when you say the country arose during COVID and then went back to sleep, that's what I have to deal with Greg every day. When we're doing the radio show, he just rolls over and goes back to sleep. So
it's tough.
Yeah, well, it's tough when you get older, right, Perrin? Isn't that right?
I wouldn't know, but I'll take your word for it.
Okay, no one's asking questions. I might as well, because you're not only a wise public policy expert, but as a reformed or retired, you take your pick, politician. What's your sense from your seat in the U.S.? How do you see the start of the election campaign, and what the issues are about?
Well, it's no surprise that it's been just dramatic in terms of the changes that have taken place as a result of two things. The first is, of course, Donald Trump, where he has become the issue. How do we respond to him and manage him? And that's the important word. It's manage. It's like,
yeah.
it's not how do we end the problem? It is how do we manage this ongoing problem, and who has the skills to do that? The other is, of course, the change in leadership in the Liberal Party. Um, Justin Trudeau had become a lightning rod for all of Canadians' frustrations. He's out of the way, and as a result, then we're seeing a significant shift in terms of political perceptions in Canada. The important thing is that this is a campaign that really will matter. People are very focused on it, and they are going to take their vote very seriously because the stakes for their country are so high.
Yeah.
One of the things, like in campaigns, sometimes it is about policy. Like, is it lowering your taxes, or is it, investing in childcare? I mean, they can be issue based, and to a large extent, it's still leadership driven. Like, people feel as though they're picking a prime minister. I think more than ever, both parties are saying we're going to be tough with Trump. We're going to fight back. I don't hear any policy really being discussed to differentiate. I do see and hear from people at a conference I was at yesterday. They're picking a prime minister, and they're going Poilievre or Carney. Who do I want to be the person sitting on the other side of the table? I don't hear a lot about the policy or the particulars about how they're going to fight back. Just wanting to know that they are. Which is very unusual because it's always a mix of leadership and policy. I just don't see much of the policy, at least not yet.
Well, some of that is deliberate on Mark Carney's part. He's essentially stolen the Conservatives' clothing. He's running against the policies that have been bedrock for the Liberals for the last 10 years. The carbon tax being a case in point. The changes to the capital gains tax. He's essentially taken the Conservative policies and said you don't have to have the Conservatives to have a change from the old policies. And it was interesting, I was watching this morning on I've set myself up to get the Canadian television here, was watching a Liberal ad on the Canadian TV where they were saying, Mark Carney understands the need for change or something along that line. But the word change was in there. There's a great irony that the person who's running to bring his party in for a fourth consecutive term is running on a platform of change, but he's doing so quite successfully at this point.
Yeah, that's amazing. We do have a question here from Nancy, I think, and I like this question. I think this would be a really interesting to get this answer or your thoughts on this. What can small business in Cambridge do to help manage through this situation? So I think what she's asking is, what do small businesses do here? What are the elements that they should be thinking about within their business to be able to get through this situation?
I think the important thing, small business is so incredibly diverse. Some of your small businesses will be export oriented and will be more vulnerable to changes with the United States. Others are much more local in their nature. Every business is going to have to go through an assessment of what are my strengths, what are my vulnerabilities here. How do I minimize the vulnerabilities? For example, on inputs, if the cost of the inputs, pardon me, that we're getting from the United States is going up dramatically, what are my other sources of supply that I can have? How can I reduce other costs? On the positive side, what are my strengths? What are the competitive advantages I have? Do I have a niche that is fairly well protected at this point, or am I vulnerable? One of the things that chambers can do in conjunction with their small businesses is to seize the moment where Canadians are very focused on what is it I can do as a consumer. And we should be stressing the importance of buy local and buy Canadian, and help to solidify this in Canadians' mind that they can really make a difference with their pocketbooks in terms of supporting our businesses here in Canada. There's no quick fix in any of this. It is a matter of just fastidiously going through and looking at the vulnerabilities and the strengths that we have. It also means, Greg and Ian, I've I said at the time of COVID, if chambers of commerce and boards of trade are important during the good times, they're essential during the bad times. We need to stand together, and we need to have a common voice on behalf of the business community. What we ask for from government needs to be reasoned and reasonable, but we need to look for ways of making common cause with each other instead of the constant squabbling that so often we see in Canada. We're in this together, and we will succeed or fail together.
Yeah, there's another question here. The government and everyone, in fact, are promoting Canadian products and made in Canada products, but this individual says they've not seen any focus or interest in promote manufacturing industry, especially small scale manufacturing industry. At the same time, mostly all the rules were against setting up manufacturing with so many hurdles. Do you see any focus from any agency or government to support that, or how? And that's probably, I guess, maybe in the wheelhouse of the chamber movement to some degree. We're working with our friends in Best Waterloo, the Waterloo EDC, Communitech, Explore Waterloo Region, and Ian at the Greater KW Chamber and me at the Cambridge Chamber. We're hoping to develop an app or get access to an app that actually will allow manufacturers to go in there and input the product identification of the supplies that they need, and it will match it with a local manufacturer that does that. So we're trying to do that, to promote large scale manufacturing that use tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, at being able to expose those tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers to those larger companies. But that's a trick. That's a real. It's almost a magic bullet to some degree. But
well, we think Tony just announced yesterday they got the first part of that up, and so that's already started. So for the question that came from our member, from the listener, that is already. I think it will put it on Chamber Check in the next day or so. But those are the sorts of things where we have suppliers and say, what are alternatives for product substitution? But again, that's going to be available pretty soon. Actually, like we've got the start of it up already on as a test case or a pilot.
Yeah.
And that's important. There's no one silver bullet. There are a whole series of things that we have to layer on top of each other to really make a difference. But the question talked about the impediments that were in the way. The simple fact is that government has been a burden, it's been an impediment, and we need to look at what we can do to make things happen as opposed to finding excuses for why things shouldn't happen. So we need to re-examine the whole of the regulatory burden. This has gone way overboard in terms of the crushing burden that we've put on businesses today. And we need to strip a lot of that back. We need to have people in government who focus on how do I facilitate as opposed to how do I prevent. And whether that's construction of big projects or whether it's investment in new areas, the goal should be to make things happen as opposed to preventing them from happening. And as a result, our politicians are going to have to re-examine both the principles that underlie so many of the public policies they've had, but also the way in which they have been implemented. We need to roll back the cost of government. It's simply too expensive today, and the size of the public service has grown completely out of step with the growth in the economy or of the public as a whole. We need to confine government to the areas where it has a critical role to play, as opposed to extending it into all sorts of areas where it doesn't do it well and where the private sector could do it better. And we need to be innovative in terms of how we provide government services, how we facilitate economic activity. We need to, you mentioned earlier, Greg, the review of the tax system. We've been calling for that for over 10 years. The last full review that was done of Canada's tax system, none of the party leaders had been born. We need to take a tax system that has become old, cumbersome, and it stands in the way of economic development. It's inefficient. And we need to do a full review to say, how do we make it more fair, more efficient, and less costly to administer? So this should be an extremely busy time for public policy with a re-examination of both the assumptions and the on which policies are based, and the outcomes of the structures and actions that are taken by government in response to this.
You know, Perrin, you hit on something which has been at the nub for as long as when you were in government, Greg and I on city councils. The one of the things that just is obvious is business is always about how do I get to yes, and government and regulation is always about why we're told that the answer has to be no, and that's a fundamental difference between the private sector and the public sector, and it has to change because the things you talk about, regulatory reform, exiting government from different aspects of being in the economy where they don't need to be. Because if you're a hammer, everything's a nail, and if you're a bureaucrat, the answer is always no because the rules say no. And we have to get to how do you do pipelines? How do you make it easier for investment? How do you do the things that are going to grow the economy, not stifle it? And that has been an issue for the entire time I've been at the Chamber of Commerce, and we've talked about that every year at our conference. We talk about those things, and I hope that they'll be addressed in the midst of this, what I think is clearly a crisis for the Canadian economy.
Well, I've been in both government. First part of my career was in government. The second half of it in the private sector. And just to state what you were stating in a different way. The government focuses on process.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a committee here? Have we studied this? How do we mitigate the risk? How do we respond to criticism? How do we avoid some problem that may occur? So they focus on process. The private sector focuses on outcomes. How do I make it happen? How do I get this built? How do I make the sale? How do I get this to my customer? And these are very different ethics. What we have to do is to rebalance here much more toward a private sector ethic where we're looking at we need to get things done in Canada again. We're a nation of builders that can't get anything built. There's something wrong when that happens. We're the most blessed country in the world in terms of our resource base, and yet we have debates about whether or not we should get our products to market. And this just doesn't make any sense. We need to change that.
For sure. We got two more questions here I'd like to get to. First one is, I think it's fair to say that our politicians who have been dealing with the U.S. so far since the U.S. election have a variety of styles and approaches. What style do you think is most successful right now? The tit-for-tat, bolder approach, or a measured work-the-room approach? Or are we still trying to figure it out?
I think when we're dealing with Donald Trump, we're still trying to figure it out, and we'll be continuing this for the next 4 years. But what's important for us is to be measured in what we do and thoughtful in what we do. It should not be sort of knee-jerk. We need to say, what are the implications of what we're looking at? Are we going to make the situation better or worse? For example, when we're looking at how do we apply counter tariffs, we need to do that in areas where it's felt in the United States, but where the impact in Canada is as low as possible, where Canadians where those American products aren't essential, where there's a Canadian company that's producing the product, or where we can substitute from Europe or Asia or South America or anywhere else. It doesn't make sense to simply do exact tit for tat. We need to be adult. It's not particularly helpful to get engaged in name calling. You're dealing with an expert whose whole career seems to be based on name calling and demeaning others. We need to be the adults in the room. So calm, determined, deliberate in what we do, absolutely serious about it, and sending a clear message that we won't be broken.
Yeah. This is a great question here. It plays right into your 17 years at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and probably your previous stint at the CME as well. Do we need the equivalent of an executive order to get interprovincial trade barriers taken down? It should not have taken Donald Trump to get this started.
This is absolutely correct. Absolutely, it should not have taken Trump to get this going. I think there's now the political will on the part of the provinces to make it happen. In theory, the federal government could have used the trade and commerce power. But doing that would have created a constitutional crisis in Canada. Uh, if they seize the moment and recognize the way in which public opinion has swung so dramatically, all of the politicians are going to be saying, we are going to voluntarily take these barriers down. We're going to have mobility so that people can practice their trades right across the country, and we're going to ensure that a manufacturer in KW and Cambridge are able to sell their goods anywhere in Canada without a penalty.
Yeah. There's one other question or comment.
Let him jump in. Who
sorry.
asked that question? Yep. Go ahead.
No, sorry. No, thanks, Perrin, for that answer. Indeed, for a great session. I mean, I'm just speaking from experience. 27 years here in Kemp First, and figured out we had to register trademarks in every single province.
It's crazy
to be able to sell products. Like, obviously barriers for trade and movement of people and that, but it seems like it's 150 years going on, and for a country with such a small population, relatively speaking, for such a large landmass, it just it takes something more than just constant kind of discussion to make it happen. It takes some more, dare I say it, authoritarian approach.
Yeah.
Well, and what governments need to do is they need to go to the principles that you use in manufacturing, where you identify every element in the process. You say for each one, does it add value or is it a cost? You invest in the things that add value, you get rid of the things that drive up costs. So much of the process of government adds no value, that consumers aren't safer, or it doesn't increase consumer choice.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that the environment is better protected. They simply add cost. We need to sweep so much of that away and focus on the things that actually facilitate or that make a difference.
Thanks. Yeah.
Danny had a question, a quick question. We only got 2 minutes left. So, and just to answer a little bit of your question, Danny, there are also companies in the United States looking to open in Canada as well, because they also deal in the European Union, and they're going to be tariffed going that way as well. But some companies are already announcing moving a factory from Canada to the U.S., like Prepack in BC, or announcing major U.S. investments like Hyundai. It seems like Trump is starting to get what he wants. Do you see a concern for this? I think Hyundai and even Honda's announcement, and even I think what was the other Taiwan company, the chip company? That one was all of these have been announced back in when Biden was president. So these are not, they don't make these decisions in 15 minutes sitting around a table saying Trump wants us to do that. These are long, these take years, sometimes a decade to decide to move. But Perrin, should we be worried about that now?
Yes, absolutely. And we're already seeing the effect in terms of an investment chill in Canada, where businesses are saying, I don't know what the rules are going to be. I'm pulling back and holding off making a decision. And if it appears that the tariffs are going in and are going to be there to stay, for example, in the automotive sector, you're apt to find manufacturers saying, I'm going to have to be on the other side of the wall, and I'm going to have to be able to be closer to my customer. And what Trump is doing with these tariffs is, first of all, to destabilize the economies of his trading partners and create uncertainty there. The business hates uncertainty. Secondly, he's raising vast amounts of money that he can use to offset the tax cuts that he's making. Third, people are missing the fact that in the United States, he's doing a major regulatory reform and making other changes that are designed to make the U.S. more business friendly domestically. And fourth, the tariffs provide a wall of protection for manufacturers and other suppliers in the United States. That means they don't have to be as efficient as a Canadian company would have to be. They can still hold on to their market. So all of this certainly will have an effect on people's investment decisions, and it means then that Canada has to take all of this on board as we design our response.
Right.
Listen,
well, thanks very much, Perrin, for joining us this week. That was fantastic. Obviously, you can see, there's a lot of interest in having your wisdom at the table. We're going to probably call on you when you get back home next week, and at some point, and certainly help us navigate this with our members. it's going to be a challenge, as you say, but
It sure will.
but we'll be resilient as we possibly can. So
Thanks so much for having me.
and we'll see everyone next week.
Okay, thanks. Have a great day, everyone. We're